Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us on this core recruitment webinar. Core recruitment has been doing lots of different panel and individual interviews with business leaders through the COVID-19 crisis. Core LGBT started about 18 months ago with lots of physical events in beautiful places like Curtin Members Club, Green King, Box Park, Kimpton Hotel, great places like that. And we've been trying to keep Core LGBT going through the crisis with a number of different interviews with Mark Webster, Keegan Hurst, and today's very special interview with Amazin LêThi, who's going to be telling us a little bit about her story. I'm going to give a brief introduction to Amazin, and then we can get straight into some questions and then take things from there. But if you want to see any of our back catalogue of interviews or get involved with Core LGBT in any way, it's all on our website, www.corerecruitment.com. Now, if you haven't heard of Amazin LêThi before, where have you been? But also, she's an athlete, ally, and Stonewall ambassador and the founder of the Amazin LêThi Foundation. She shares her personal journey and from homelessness to becoming one of the world's most visible and influential LGBTQ human rights and sports advocates in the world. Amazin, was that everything? Did I miss anything in your repertoire there? Can you give us a little bit more about your journey so far?
Sure. I mean, you know, I think in terms of being an advocate, it really comes from my background experience and the journey that I had as a child of being bullied constantly. I grew up in an all-white background, so I was physically very different. So I was bullied constantly for being Asian, but I also felt very different inside. You know, I had a lot of challenges with my sexuality. You know, I didn't see an Asian person on TV or in the media. I didn't see an LGBTQ person at all in the media or meet any LGBTQ people in person. So I felt very alone and very insular and isolated with my feelings. And I think many LGBTQ people, particularly Asian LGBTQ people, because we just don't have the representation in TV and film and in society. So, you know, that bullying, you know, continued in terms of society. I was bullied by school kids. I remember one prominent moment, the teacher, when I was a child, made me stand up in front of the entire class and said, this is what failure looked like. And at most in life, I would be the child that would fail. And I just remember standing there as a kid thinking, like, there were 30 other kids in the class and they were just all laughing at me. And I thought, I just can't cry. And I feel so humiliated and so worthless. And then I sat down.
And this was in Australia, yeah? This wasn't...
Yeah, so I spent time as a child in Australia in a time where it was very difficult for the Asian community. And then, you know, when I sat down, you know, the teacher threw a blackboard eraser and it hit me, the wooden bit, at my head. And I just thought, I'll never be made to feel this humiliated, and never, ever would like anyone to go through this kind of experience. And a lot of LGBTQ kids go through bullying, through the system, through society, through the school administration, through kids. So there's, you know, this journey of bullying that follows you as you grow up. And I never felt like I fitted in anywhere or any kind of community. And I really fell into sports. It really became my haven. And this is kind of why I champion so much work through sports and equality. And I did a lot of team sports as a kid, but I found the bullying and racism followed me into sports because, you know, you don't see that many Asian people in professional sports. You know, obviously we have very unique challenges as to the reasons why you don't. And so my team picked on me. I had coaches that picked on me. It was very apparent, the stereotype of what it is to be Asian in sports. And I remember a coach pulling me aside and saying, you know, Asian kids are slow at sports. We're quite geeky. You know, you're not going to be very good at a sprinter. You know, you're slow, you're the slowest person in the team. Maybe long distance running is better for you. So I was kind of pushed out of sprinting, which I loved, and then into long distance running, which I was good at. So I kind of fitted that stereotype, but I just still felt very alone and isolated in my feelings. And I just really didn't feel comfortable in team sports. I didn't feel celebrated, and I didn't feel acknowledged or appreciated at all. And it was really by accident that I fell into weight training and bodybuilding. There was, some dumbbells lying around the house. And so, I actually wanted to get stronger because I felt that the sports that I was doing wasn't giving me the confidence or the strength to stand up to the bullies. And weight training just did that for me. I mean, because your physical appearance starts to change. It boosted my confidence and my morale, and my worthiness. I had very low self-worth, and I felt stronger. I started going to the gym at a very young age. I was kind of like, 8 or so when I started going to the gym. So I went instantly from kids sports to suddenly male-dominated, misogynistic, very heteronormative, very sexist, that locker room talk, gym environments, which was a little bit, overwhelming for me. And obviously the men, they didn't really know how to react to, an Asian kid there, and the owner didn't really care as well. So it kind of became my kind of babysitting, where I just stayed there for hours on end. I loved the sport. I, looked at all the health and fitness magazines, and even though I received so much sexism, I really wanted to keep up with the sport because of the way it made me feel. And I really, looking back, see it as a survival mechanism. But I encountered a terrible amount of sexism, though, within it.
Yeah. If you don't mind me asking, what age were you when that thing happened with the eraser in the classroom?
Oh gosh, I must have been like 7, 8. I was a kid at the time.
Really formative.
Yes, and those kind of formative years really affect you because you do carry that trauma as an adult. And I think in many LGBTQ people can pinpoint moments in their lives as a child where they were really bullied, and even as adults, but really as children, because you're still trying to work out who you are in this world. And your formative years are so important. And for many, for me, like many other LGBT kids, there was this kind of constant bullying that you have to come up against in this discovery of who you are. So I started competing as a teenager in bodybuilding. I'm just naturally very competitive in sports, but people really didn't know how to handle me because it's so unusual. A young Asian woman who wanted to have a career as a competitive bodybuilder. And then I, qualified and started training other athletes, and other Olympic hopefuls. I ended up writing some health and fitness books as well, but I still carried so much trauma inside of me with all this bullying and racism, and still the confusion of my sexuality. And bodybuilding is a very straight sport and masculine sports, and it, the federation let you know very quickly that you could not come out in sports. I never imagined a moment where I could ever be my authentic self in sports. Wow. Because the federation just made it very, very clear that you couldn't.
And obviously very topical at the moment, but with obviously in the midst of the pandemic, people are talking about sport coming back behind closed doors without audiences. How do you feel about that?
I think, a lot of people don't like that feeling because they feel like, that's the whole joy of sports, seeing the fans in the audience and being there. But I just feel the pandemic has made us all reset and think very differently of the world that we want to have coming out of the shutdown. And that includes sports as well. And for me, I don't mind if there's an audience or not, as long as those that love playing sports get the opportunity to play sports. And I think, through the pandemic, we've realized that we have to do so much online, and that, we still can present sports to the world just through a visual space. And yes, I absolutely understand as an athlete, the excitement and the roar of fans, you know, energizes you when you're playing sports. But, you know, we just have to think differently. We're still in a pandemic. We're in a situation where we can't have mass gatherings. We can't put people's health at risk. So we just have to look at sports differently. I love what the Asian community has done in Asia and different parts of Asia, when obviously now, you know, they've opened up much quicker than the Western world. And what they have done is that they've put soft toys in the stadium. So just as some kind of like, as a presence for the athletes, that someone is watching over them. I just think that's a nice touch. And in the terms of like their social distancing, when you go to a cafe, instead of sitting by yourself, they have like a plush toy panda to sit next to you, so you feel like you have some company.
Nice. Now, I think you covered a little bit about what got you into bodybuilding, but could you give us a little bit about anybody who inspired you while you were going through that time, and also just a little bit more about what it's given you in terms of focus?
Sure. I mean, because I didn't have any role models growing up, I had no points of reference in terms of who I could become and who I was then. You know, finding that narrative is very difficult. That's why I share my story now, because of that power of storytelling. All my time in the gym, particularly reading all the bodybuilding magazines, there was just like this one person who kept popping up and sharing his story, which was Arnold Schwarzenegger. And his story really resonated with me. I mean, obviously we couldn't be any more different, but what really resonated me was that person of difference, that, you know, he had a strange name. No one could pronounce it. He had this funny accent. He came from a part of the world that no one really, you know, knew, and he loved bodybuilding, and he had this dream to make this impact through sports. And he really made an impact with me, because all the time in the gym, I was just able to learn about his journey and his story and the struggles that he had through sports and finding his way to the US and having this amazing career that he has had. So he truly made an impact with me, because I really felt then that there was someone different who had that I could look at as a mirror image, that was highly successful through bodybuilding and through sports, and could make an impact in the world. So, you know, he became my only role model. And then, you know, because I didn't really have that many friends at school, I used to go to the library a lot and read. And, you know, I read about people that had these extraordinary dreams, like Walt Disney and Colonel Sanders from KFC. And those people really resonated with me, because they just had these amazing stories that they had dreamed a dream from their imagination and made it happen. And for me as a child, that's really what I was doing, because I never saw anyone like me do what I was doing. So I had to kind of dream a dream and hope that it would happen.
Absolutely. Now, the pandemic has led to some pretty widespread racism towards the Asian community and anti-Asian sentiment, naming kind of COVID-19. You've been really vocal about this. Can you tell me a little bit about how it's affected the Asian community during the pandemic?
Sure. I think, you know, we didn't know that this pandemic would cause widespread coronavirus racism globally towards the Asian community. That's affected me, plus obviously the Asian community. And I think what is dangerous is that when you attach an ethnicity to a virus, and we've seen very clearly with the Trump administration, and they continue to do this, you know, the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus, the Kung Flu virus, and kind of saying, well, this is where it came from, and this is why we need to call it that. But you don't understand how it affects and impacts our community. There's always been racism towards our community, but it's always been very invisible, because we're seen as this invisible model minority race when nothing happens to us. So this coronavirus racism, for the first time, has exposed the widespread ignorance towards the Asian community, or how little people know about our community, but also the widespread xenophobia and othering and racism. And the stories, I mean, it's been absolutely global. I mean, in the US, it's become so bad. The FBI have been involved. You know, they've had to set up special hotlines and task force and tracking systems. In the UK, you've had over 300 cases of racism because of the virus, and many, particularly Chinese students, heading back to Asia, you know, knowing that it just isn't safe for them. And in Australia, the coronavirus racism per capita is more than that of the US. And, you know, I think it's kind of highlighted within all these different communities, the systemic history of racism towards the Asian community. And, you know, I've had racist remarks thrown at me as well, you know, definitely through ignorance. And I think, you know, I think about the young Asian kids for the first time experiencing racism and not understanding why people are hating them just because of who they are. And I think of how what I went through as a child, and that was the same thing of people just hating you for being Asian, because the virus, you know, doesn't discriminate. It has affected everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you talk to us a little bit about your thoughts on Asian representation in sports and media currently?
Sure. I mean, I do so much work around championing equality through sports, particularly through the lens of being Asian, and the challenges and barriers that Asian athletes face going to pro level, because we just don't have that representation. I mean, when I look at UK sports, we barely have a South Asian athlete, let alone an East Asian athlete representing Team GB. I mean, even in the US, where you have over 22 million Asian people, there aren't that many at pro level. And I always cite Jeremy Lin, the professional basketball player, who received so much racism because he was Asian, and though he was so good, and just how the media spun that racism. And we have to go right down to the school level in terms of how Asian kids are perceived in sports and that stereotype. And you see it at the professional level where, you know, at the Olympic Games in Korea, you never saw so many Asian American athletes there and Asian athletes, because it's just that perception that, you know, we're better at the more petite sports, or because of our physical frame in terms of ice skating compared to the more physical sports like NFL. I mean, it's a matter of checking our unconscious bias as to the reasons why, you know, Asian kids are bullied the most in sports and have the highest dropout rates, why they don't want to participate in sports. And if they make it to the youth academy level, why recruiters aren't choosing Asian youth to recruit them into teams, and then why they don't reach college level, and if they do, the amount of racism that they receive. And if they do reach professional level, you know, they're usually one of one, so they face very unique challenges. If, you know, and then an Asian kid sees that in the media, that they see that one Asian professional athlete, and all they hear is the amount of racism that Asian athlete receives, and why would they want to put themselves out in that position? And then if that Asian athlete is gay on top of that, it's like a double whammy of racism or homophobia or biphobia or transphobia. So there's a lot of work that we need to do at the school level with school administrations around training around you know, unconscious bias, cultural sensitivity training. It's not just encouraging more Asian athletes, but we have to have more Asian coaches as well. And also we have to educate particularly sports media and the language they use and how they speak about Asian athletes in the community. Because for a lot of people who haven't met an Asian person, this is how they learn about Asian people, through sports or through the media, and through these kind of negative connotations and words that are used.
Yeah, I completely agree. Now, obviously, research for this meeting, I did a lot of reading into your background, your stories, some of the videos, and all of that kind of stuff as well. Your journey to date is pretty incredible. Could you talk us through a little bit of that period of your life when you were homeless and what led you to that and how you kind of came through that?
Sure. I mean, as a child, as I said, I was bullied a lot. I suffered a terrible amount of racism. I held a lot of trauma in as well. And I think, when you hold that amount of trauma that you have had over your life, at some point you're going to explode. And, as a young adult, like many of us, we're a paycheck away from poverty. We're one person away from ending up in the bad crowd and it just kind of spiraling out of control. And, that's what happened to me. I just, it exploded in terms of the way I felt, because it was like a pressure cooker waiting to explode. And I just ended up in a bad crowd that was, partying all night, doing drugs, drinking, and, lots of other things. And I just spiraled out of control. And I just, ended up finding myself homeless. And it was the hardest point and darkest years I have had, living in and out of different shelters, having severe mental health, very suicidal, constantly, very, very depressed, heavily in debt, and just kind of feeling like I just kind of hit rock bottom and the margins of the world, and seeing how society treats you when you are right at the margins. And when I think of homeless LGBTQ youth, they only make up 3 to 5% of the youth population, but over 40 to 50% are made homeless. And I share my story because I know what it feels like, and that experience of, I remember begging in the street once, and it's just so demoralizing, just the way people look at you as if you're absolutely worthless and that you haven't tried at all in your life, but they don't know your story and your circumstance. It was really hard to pull myself out, and I absolutely realized that many people don't. And I'm very fortunate that I'm here today, able to share my story. For me, it was...
If you don't mind me asking, when you were at that point, what stopped you and what pulled you back?
I just remember having a moment where I slept for 2 days straight. I woke up on the third day, just crying uncontrollably, kind of in a fetal position in the corner of the shelter, thinking, what has become of my life? I've literally just hit rock bottom, and I could go down further or I could go up, and somehow I have to pull myself up. And I think, I pulled on sports that, I think sports has become my survival mechanism, pushing past the pain barrier, pushing past very difficult circumstances for me, because I think, as an athlete, you always have to push yourself to win, particularly if you're a competitive athlete, and it gives you these very unique skill sets. So I was able to pull on that, but also I felt that I wasn't ready to go yet. And something inside of me, it was like, I have so much more to give and I don't know what it is. And it's kind of a strange thing to think of when you're like right at rock bottom and you have absolutely nothing to give, just kind of in that moment. And I just thought, I have to pull myself out. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I have to do it. And it took me so long to do. And I had a nervous breakdown while doing it. And after that, it just took me years to get over. And I think I look back and I thank the fact that I'm an athlete, and through my sports background gave me that mindset to go back to. And I just had this big why of like, I had a larger purpose and I wanted to make an impact. But also as well, I went back to that moment, and I think sometimes we just have this trigger moment when that teacher made me stand up in the class and said to everyone, at most in life, like I was the one that was going to fail. I just kind of thought that if I ended my life, that would be my biggest failure, and the teacher would have won. And it kind of like, under no circumstances I'm going to let that win. So, yeah, and this is kind of why I'm here today. But it's very difficult, and I understand so many people just don't have that in them, and that resilience to pull themselves out, and that kind of unique skill set that you need to draw on. And that's why I say that, you know, particularly LGBTQ youth, everyone should participate in sports as a child, because you just build this very unique skill set that you can pull on in that time of need.
Absolutely. Now, you've spoken globally to some incredible audiences across government, blue chip companies. I mean, Stanford, EY, Google, Stonewall, the US Embassy, the UN. Which do you feel has been most impactful, and why?
You know, for me, when I kind of looked at how I could make the greatest impact in the world, I realized I need to be in the room with decision makers who can make that impact. And I think for me, my greatest impact has been made when I'm able to sit in the room with governments and businesses and community leaders on the ground, because I think it's like a three-pronged approach. Because, you know, companies that are working in a country, absolutely they need to champion equality, particularly when they're working in more hostile situations with anti-LGBTQ laws, but they need to have those decision makers in the room, and that's, you know, heads of state and the governments of those countries. So for me, that's where I've been able to make the greatest impact. And I've worked with, and I continue to work with governments all over the world in terms of having closed door discussions around equality, how they can use sport as a platform to champion LGBT equality, what it is like for Asian people within their country, and as well as open door discussions where I bring in business leaders so we can have these discussions together of, you know, what are the steps that we can take to work towards equality in, you know, your country. And, you know, during Pride Month, I've been having discussions with the UK governments, in Asia and in the US, and I've been having discussions with the Mexican governments as well. I think, you know, as I've been very fortunate as a global advocate to be able to have all these different intersectional discussions. And I think countries can learn from different advocates from different countries, you know, how we're doing it in our own country, and then what are those best practices that they can take to their country.
Absolutely. Now, there's been a lot of talk through the pandemic regarding mental health. And can you tell us a little bit about your experience and what advice you would give to others? Sure.
I mean, you know, I think I'm one of everyone in the world that has found the pandemic very challenging. You know, the isolation from people that you love, touch isolation as well. I think we realized how much we miss touch, even it's just like, you know, shaking someone's hand. You just can't do that anymore. What I didn't realize was that the pandemic triggered my moment when I was homeless, of how I felt isolated and very helpless. And I didn't realize I would have that trigger moment, but I was able to catch it and acknowledge it and realize where it was coming from and what steps I took then to be able to lift my spirits and lift myself out. And just to acknowledge that I had been through one of the hardest situations in my life, and this was obviously probably the second hardest one, but the first one I was able to overcome it and know that I could do it again. And I think, you know, for many LGBTQ people, we go through many difficult situations in terms of our own discovery and who we are and the bullying that we might have faced, but we need to realize that we've been through so much but still standing, and that we are very resilient as human beings. In terms of managing my mental health, I think it's important to kind of look at what you enjoy and what helps you through to kind of settle your emotional fitness. For me, being able to still exercise regularly, if that's still being able to go outside in nature, if not making sure that I exercise at home. I think it's very important because we've just been bombarded with so much news about the pandemic, to make sure you take time away from news feeds and social media and the internet. So I make sure in the evenings, 2 hours or 3 hours before I go to bed, I don't look at any social media or TV, and I listen to classical music because it really helps just calm my mind. I meditate every single day. I think for many of us, where the anxiety and the worry comes from is when our mind starts racing into the future of uncertainty. Because yes, we're still in a pandemic and the future is very uncertain, but we have to continually make sure that we're standing in the present, because when we start racing into the future, our mind then needs a story to hold on to. That's when we start making up all these horrible stories that might happen, which then kind of obviously starts spiraling our mental health. So I do a lot of meditation, and then connecting to loved ones, to my friends. I think, I know in myself, and I know by speaking to other people, that we've never felt so connected through the power of the internet, in terms of, virtual events that we can log on to, like this one, support networks, and just being, instead of calling a friend, we're doing more video chats with friends. And I think, these small things can help, settle your emotional fitness during, a very challenging time.
Absolutely, it's good advice. Now, again, in doing my research, I read that you identify as being rainbow, which I love that connotation completely. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, in the Vietnam, I noticed with my work in Vietnam, everyone would say rainbow. And I really like that term. I think LGBTQIA, plus is a real mouthful. And I think, and in different countries, the words are around in different ways. Sometimes we forget a letter and someone gets upset that we've forgotten their letter. And I feel that the spectrum of gender and sexuality is so much wider than, 4 or 5 letters. And I love the term rainbow because it's uplifting. After a thunderstorm, everyone loves to see a rainbow. And I feel it encompasses everyone under the umbrella of the rainbow. And it's much easier to say than LGBTQIA plus.
Yes, exactly. Now, on a very serious note of Black Lives Matters, the world, and I think everybody, was being completely shocked by the recent events in America, specifically around George Floyd and others since, seeing the kind of community out there kind of like mobilize against kind of like, the racial injustice which is going on. Why is athletic activism kind of like important?
Sports is a language that everyone understands. It unifies us in a way like no other. Every country participates in sports, and everyone has some kind of passion to sports. And sports has always been used as athlete activism. If we go back to 1968 with the Olympics, with the 2 African-American athletes that, put their fist in the air towards ending racism and, supporting human rights, and to, Colin Kaepernick taking the knee to, racial injustice and social inequality. It's such a powerful global platform, and athletes, are like pop stars. Because of social media, they have millions of followers who admire them, who look up to them. And we've seen now through, particularly through the pandemic and through what Colin Kaepernick does, it can send a ripple effect to change hearts and minds. So, I think it's, as an athlete in myself, I think, it's my responsibility to ignite sports and to use athlete activism to challenge, the social justice and the racial inequality that so many people of color face. And I think, through this pandemic, we haven't had sports. Everyone has missed sports. And as we come out of the shutdown, we need to think about what kind of brave new world do we want. It's given us a time to reset, sports is just starting all over the world. And we are seeing that, you know, athletes are taking a stand, and we can really use sports as we're heading towards Tokyo 2021 as this platform for social change.
Now, when you are speaking to kind of like large organizations like the UN and kind of like, you know, organizations like that, I think that's one thing, but there's lots of mid-sized and smaller organizations, and with it being Pride Month, they're kind of looking at what they can do to show their support for Pride. What advice would you give to kind of much more minute organizations?
Sure. You know, when I think of, you know, supporting Pride, you know, it's not just a hashtag. It's not just, you know, putting up the rainbow flag in June, because, you know, rainbow people, gay people, you know, we are who we are 365 days a year. And I think, you know, because of this shutdown, you can be innovative, you know, have virtual events, you know, use social media to share stories from the community, share stories from your colleagues who may be openly out. Look at the, you know, organizations that you're supporting, you know, where are you giving your money to? Think about LGBTQ organizations in your community that you can donate or levitate through your social media, and other little things that you can do which have a long-lasting effect of, you know, do you have a LGBTQ workplace equality policy? Do you have a policy for the transgender community? You know, do you support the transgender community in terms of health insurance, in terms of transitioning in work? Do you have gender neutral toilets? You know, are you wearing a rainbow pin? I think there's always an awkwardness around pronouns. You know, don't be afraid to ask someone's pronouns. And if you're afraid to ask, you start with saying, hello, my name is Amazin, my pronouns are she and her, which will usually instigate the other person to do that. Look at, you know, we're sending emails every second of the day. Put your pronouns on your signature. Put that you're an LGBTQ ally in your signature. So there's kind of little things that you can do. And then obviously the bigger things of, you know, are you doing workplace training regarding unconscious bias, regarding D&I, you know, and, you know, internal LGBTQ conversations, you know, are there executive sponsors who will sponsor your Pride network? So all these little things that you can do along the way, or, you know, working with an advocate like myself who can come into your company and share my story and work with you to build a, you know, a proper D&I strategy, or assist with those challenging conversations around being Asian and LGBTQ in the workplace, because it does look different in the West and the East.
And just a quick extra question, because I'm aware you've got another call to get onto, but are there any LGBT organizations in particular that you support?
Sure, obviously my own one, the Amazin LêThi Foundation. I'm a sports champion, ambassador to Athlete Ally in the US, and Stonewall UK in the UK. I mean, you know, two fantastic organizations that are championing equality through sports, and obviously my organization that champions equality through sports, but also, you know, looks at supporting LGBTQ youth who are experiencing homelessness through leadership and sports development programming.
Excellent. And now, in interviews you've said before that the process of coming out is seen as in Western ideology, but in the Asian community it's called coming home. Can you explain a little bit around that?
Sure. I think there's always this kind of push of, you know, tell me your coming out story. When are you going to come out? And I always think we have to rephrase it to when did you feel comfortable to invite the world into your story? Or, you know, how do we create safe and nurturing environments so someone can feel comfortable to invite another person into their story? And I think that's a nicer way of saying it, because it lessens the stress in that person, because not everyone wants to share their story. A lot of people just want to feel comfortable inside in terms of being LGBTQ. For Asian people, it's the reverse, because it's all about, as soon as we're born, about coming home and what are we doing for the family in terms of where we study, what job do we have, how much money we're going to make, because in the end we have to support generations of families within our own family units. And also, you know, we have a very, you know, it's a very conservative culture, and it's very kind of gender norm in terms of, you know, this is a woman and this is a man. Heaven forbid if you're anything else but that. So that, you know, a lot of shame and failure is used in terms of pushing Asian people back into the closet. But I think people really need to be made, you know, understand the difference of being, you know, Asian and LGBTQ compared to being LGBTQ coming from a different background in terms of the language that is used and, you know, how we see our own coming out journey.
Absolutely. Now, when I mentioned before that we did our Mark Foster interview, and Zoom very kindly allows you to track where in the world, location-wise, people kind of like log in from. And it's one of these things that when we've been doing physical events, we get, like, you know, we may get 300 people that sign up to come to an event, and you end up with 100 people who actually show up. So our dropout rate tends to be quite high. And I think a lot of that is because people sometimes get scared or intimidated or don't want to come along kind of last minute and show up. But I mean, the video that we've released has now been viewed in just under a week. I mean, it's been viewed just in the Middle East over 300 times by people. I guess that kind of invites this question about what advice you would give to employers, kind of like, you know, in the Middle East who are trying to support their people, or what advice you'd give generally to people out there who are LGBT and are looking for some guidance and support.
Sure. I mean, it is very difficult, you know, living in a hostile environment that doesn't support who you are, has anti-LGBTQ laws that can be at times very archaic. And, you know, and last year I went to Qatar and sat with all the embassies on the ground because, you know, Doha will be getting the World Cup in a number of years. So it's like, you know, how do we have these conversations around equality, and how do we champion equality in more hostile situations? You know, I think, you know, there's that power of the internet. Obviously, when you're in a country where you can't openly be who you are, because that may lead to persecution, there is then the power of the internet to be able to connect with other LGBTQ advocates like myself and the community globally. And, you know, to be able to listen in on virtual conversations like this, to know that, you know, your story isn't singular and that you're not alone, you're part of a larger community that loves and celebrates who you are, and that, you know, you have worth, and you have worth in terms of the love for yourself and the love for others, from others, and that you're enough and you've always been enough. Because sometimes, for the most part, you know, we never hear that. In terms of, you know, what employers can do, you know, sometimes it's very challenging for an employer working in an environment, but, you know, they need to champion equality, because that's the only way that we're going to be able to change hearts and minds. And for many multinationals working in companies where there are anti-LGBTQ laws, they do have a voice because they lift the countries through the economy, so they have power as one. But, you know, I always say to multinationals working in these types of countries, you need to unify as a group, because you're stronger in mass than you are as one. And then, you know, unify with the embassies on the ground. And they may be conversations like, you know, we will not bring this sports event to your country because we do not know if, you know, LGBTQ people will be safe, so we will take our business elsewhere, or we will pull our, you know, company out of your country if you don't change the laws. I mean, I think of what the work that, you know, for me as an ambassador for Athlete Ally, and the work that they have done with the Sochi Games in Russia, where they pushed the IOC to include sexuality and gender identity in the anti-discrimination, you know, charter that they have. And then they pushed Russia to make its statement. You know, they weren't able to abolish the propaganda law, but they were at least able to get Russia to make a statement that at least during the Olympics there would be some safety, you know. And Athlete Ally has done. And I think you need to look to other countries of what they are doing and what organizations are doing in other countries to see, can you do that in your country? So for example, Athlete Ally has done a lot of work in the southern states in the US in terms of speaking to multinationals and sports events that, you know, do not hold your sporting event in a state that has anti-LGBTQ bills. And then that state will realize how many millions that they will lose from that. You know, so all the work that I'm doing, I'm thinking, you know, what kind of conversations can I have around the World Cup? You know, what kind of conversations can I have around Beijing 2022? Because we have to have those conversations somewhere, because at some point, because we have to begin to change hearts and minds. And even if it's just a small step, it's a small step at least in the right direction.
Absolutely. Now, you, again, from research, you've been able to pivot very well during the pandemic by still managing to continue your work kind of globalistically, especially on the advocacy side of things. What do you feel the pandemic's taught you, and how different do you think your work's going to be coming out of lockdown?
The pandemic taught me to shift very quickly. I think, you know, we just took it for granted in terms of being able to have these fabulous in-person events. We used the power of the internet, but not as much as we should have been doing. And actually, this has been my busiest Pride Month I've ever had in my entire life, because the whole world has been able to connect with me in a way that, you know, if we didn't have the pandemic, I'd only be able to be in one place at any given time. So, you know, for me, I think of my advocacy very differently now that I can just do so much online. I mean, with the work that I'm doing with the UK government, next week I'm doing an event in China, but I'm, you know, not in China. And then, you know, and then I'm also doing an event, you know, in the US. I'm part of Global Pride tomorrow. That's the first 24-hour streaming Pride. And I think Prides have started to look differently as well, because, you know, we can't have an in-person event. And I think Prides have kind of taken a step back and thought, actually, we can do so much more virtually. And I think moving forward, we have to use the virtual space more. And I found that I've been able to connect far better. And there've been new opportunities that I've seen that I've been able to take part in. And I think one of them has been working with the Advocate magazine. You know, I've had a whole month having Instagram live chats with the Advocate, taking over their Instagram with high profile Hollywood out Asian, you know, actors. I don't know if I would have done that if I didn't have the pandemic, because we just weren't, you know, we were thinking differently. Yeah. And, you know, and everyone else was busy as well, working. So I really think it's, you know, the pandemic, we have to always see, if we can say something like, you know, we have to see the silver lining, because it has given us a time to reset and think differently as we move out of the shutdown in terms of what kind of world that we want and how we need to unify within different communities, and how the LGBTQ community can connect moving forward.
Absolutely. And final question, what's next for Amazin LêThi?
I'm doing now, which I have been continuing over the last year, you know, leading up to Tokyo 2021, I'm having a lot of conversations around using sport as a platform for equality, particularly looking through the Asian lens. I think we are now in a very special moment in history for Asian LGBTQ equality and sports equality, because over the next few years, all the major sports events will be in Asia. So, you know, I'm working towards that. Hopefully next year we can have some in-person events, because I will be doing some very large in-person events around the world with different governments, with the United Nations, and I will fly into Japan. And then beyond that, I'll be looking to, you know, 2022, which is a very busy year. You have the Commonwealth Games, you have, you know, Vietnam Formula One, you have Beijing 2022, you have the Gay Games in Hong Kong, you have the World Cup. And then with my own organization, so a couple of years ago, I piloted the first leadership, sports, business and education program in Asia that looked at how you could fast track LGBTQ youth out of homelessness into career path development. I will be launching that in the US next year, and still doing a lot of conversations virtually around, you know, LGBTQ equality. I think, you know, there's power in sharing your story. I think there's so much power in sharing an Asian LGBTQ story, because we just don't hear these kinds of stories. So I'll be continuing my work with governments and businesses and different community leaders around the power of storytelling and how we can change hearts and minds through looking through, you know, sports and, you know, the Asian LGBTQ lens.
That's amazing. Amazin, thank you so much for spending the time with us. I really, really appreciate it. I think your story is absolutely inspirational. And if you don't know, if you haven't seen before, then please check out all of Amazin LêThi. It's AmazinLêThi.com, isn't it?
Yes.
You can see all of the information as well. And enjoy Pride streaming tomorrow. I hope you manage to enjoy it.
Thank you very much. It's so fantastic to speak to you. Thank you.
Excellent. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.